He was 28 years old on the morning of March 14th, 1976, standing in the gravel lot behind Jensen's New Holland in Waseca, Minnesota, watching a green forage harvester roll off a flatbed trailer. It wasn't the biggest machine on the lot. It wasn't the newest. But it was the first piece of equipment he'd ever bought that wasn't used, wasn't borrowed, and wasn't co-signed by his father. The New Holland 770E had a single-row corn head, a direct cut attachment, and a price tag of $11,400. He'd saved $2,800. The rest would come from Farmers State Bank at 9.2% interest over 5 years. He signed the papers in the dealer's office at 10:15 that morning. By noon, the machine was on his trailer. By evening, it was parked in the shed next to his father's 30-year-old John Deere two-row chopper that still worked but couldn't keep up anymore. He didn't tell his father what he'd done until 2 days later. His father didn't say much, just looked at the 770E for a long time, ran his hand along the feed rolls, and asked how much the payments were going to be, $247 a month. His father nodded once and walked back to the house. That machine stayed with him for 13 years. Then it didn't. Then it came back. This is the story of what happened in between. If you found yourself here, you're likely someone who understands that the decisions we make about land and equipment aren't just financial. They're decisions about who we become and what we leave behind. These stories take time to unfold, the way farming itself does. If that resonates with you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one, and they're told the same way, slowly, carefully, and with respect for what it costs to stay. His name was Vincent Hauer, though most people called him Vince. He grew up on 240 acres of corn, soybeans, and pasture land 6 miles south of Waseca. His father, Leonard, had bought the place in 1948 with money saved from working road construction during the war years. Leonard farmed it alone until Vince was old enough to help, and then they farmed it together. Vince graduated high school in 1966. He thought about leaving. A lot of boys his age did. Some went to college. Some went to the cities looking for factory work. Some went to Vietnam and didn't come back the same. But his father's health wasn't good. Angina, the doctor said, and leaving would have meant selling the farm or leasing it out. Vince stayed. By 1970, he was doing most of the field work himself. His father handled the books and the seed orders and the trips to the co-op, but the planting, the cultivation, the harvest, all of that fell to Vince. The work was manageable until other farmers started asking him to chop silage for them. It started small. A neighbor's chopper broke down in the middle of August 1974, and Vince helped him finish his corn. The neighbor paid him $200 and told 2 other farmers. By the summer of 1975, Vince was chopping for 4 farms in addition to his own, using his father's old 2-row chopper and working 16-hour days from late July through September. The money was good, better than good. Custom chopping brought in $3,400 that summer, more than the soybean crop. But the equipment couldn't handle it. The old chopper broke down twice in August. The corn head had to be welded 3 times. Vince spent more hours fixing the machine than running it, and by the end of the season, he knew he couldn't do another year like that. He needed something reliable, something that could handle the volume, something that wouldn't cost him customers because he was late or broken down. In February of 1976, he drove to Jensen's New Holland and asked what they had. They had a 77E, single row, factory certified, available immediately. The dealer, Carl Jensen, was honest with him. He said the machine was more than Vince probably needed for his own farm. He said the payments would be tight. He said custom work was unpredictable and customers didn't always pay on time. But he also said that if Vince wanted to build something beyond his father's 240 acres, this was the kind of machine that made that possible. Vince thought about it for 3 weeks. He talked to his wife, Marie. She was worried about the debt, but she trusted him. She said if he thought it was the right move, she'd support it. He didn't talk to his father. Leonard had always been cautious about debt. He'd bought the farm with cash. He'd bought every piece of equipment outright or not at all. He believed that if you couldn't afford something today, you couldn't afford it tomorrow either. Vince understood that. He respected it. But he also knew that the world his father had farmed in didn't exist anymore. Equipment was more expensive. Land was more expensive. The margins were tighter. And if you waited until you could afford everything with cash, you'd spend your whole life waiting. On March 14th, he went back to the dealership and signed. The first season with the 770E was everything he'd hoped for. The machine ran clean, it didn't overheat, the corn head fed smoothly, and the knives stayed sharp longer than anything he'd used before. He chopped his own corn in 4 days, half the time it used to take, and then he chopped for 6 other farms between mid-August and late September. He charged $12 an acre. Some farmers thought that was high. Most paid it anyway because Vince showed up on time and finished the job without breakdowns. By the end of October, he'd brought in $4,100 from custom work. After expenses and the first few payments on the 770E, he cleared $2,600. It was the best year he'd ever had. His father didn't say much about it. Vince thought maybe that meant approval, or maybe it just meant his father didn't want to argue about something that was already done. In the spring of 1977, Vince bought a used haybine and added custom mowing to his services. By 1978, he had 12 regular customers. By 1980, he'd paid off half the loan on the 77E and was thinking about adding a second chopper. Marie was pregnant with their second child. They'd saved enough to add a bedroom onto the house. Vince's father's angina had worsened, but the farm was stable, and the custom work was covering more than just equipment. It was covering the life they were building. And then 1981 came. Interest rates went to 18%. Fertilizer costs doubled. Corn prices dropped to 2.35 cents a bushel, the lowest they'd been in years. Vince's custom work held steady. Farmers still needed their silage chopped, but 3 of his best customers couldn't pay him until the following spring. One of them never paid at all. He went under in November and sold out at auction. Vince had $1,800 in unpaid invoices and a $247 monthly payment that didn't care whether his customers could pay or not. He cut back everywhere he could. No new equipment, no unnecessary repairs. Marie went back to work part-time at the co-op in town. They didn't take a vacation. They didn't replace the truck when the transmission started slipping. By the spring of 1982, Vince was 3 months behind on the loan. The bank called him in. The loan officer's name was Roger Stenmark. He was younger than Vince, maybe 30, and he had a folder with Vince's payment history in front of him. Roger said the bank wasn't interested in taking the equipment. He said they wanted Vince to succeed. But he also said that if Vince couldn't catch up by December, they'd have to move forward with repossession. Vince asked what catch up meant. Roger said it meant $741 by year end, plus staying current on new payments. Vince left the bank and sat in his truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes. He had 3 options. He could sell the 770E privately and pay off the loan. That would leave him with maybe $3,000 in his pocket and no way to do custom work. He could borrow money from his father. Leonard had some savings, maybe $8,000. But Vince had never asked his father for money, and he didn't want to start now, especially not to fix a decision his father had never fully supported. Or he could work harder, take on more customers, cut costs deeper, bet that 1983 would be better than 1982. He chose the third option. He picked up 4 new custom jobs that summer. 2 of them were small, 20 acres each, but they paid on time. He chopped his own corn in 3 days and spent the next 6 weeks working other people's fields from dawn until after dark. Marie handled the books. She tracked every invoice, every payment, every expense. She reminded customers when they were overdue. She stretched the grocery budget and stopped buying anything that wasn't necessary. Their son, Nathan, was 4 years old. Their daughter, Emily, was born that September. Marie brought her home from the hospital on a Tuesday and went back to work at the co-op the following Monday. By November, Vince had brought in enough to cover the past due amount and stay current through December. In January of 1983, Roger Stenmark called and said the bank was satisfied. The account was in good standing. Vince didn't celebrate. He just went back to work. The next 6 years were stable. Not easy, but stable. Corn prices stayed low, but they didn't drop further. Vince's custom work grew slowly. He added 2 more customers in 1984, 3 more in 1986. The 770E kept running. He replaced the corn head in 1985 and the blower belt in 1987, but the machine itself never failed him. His father passed away in the spring of 1988. The funeral was small. Leonard left the farm to Vince outright. No debts, no liens, just the land and the equipment and the responsibility of keeping it going. Vince thought maybe that meant he'd finally done something his father respected. He kept the old 2-row chopper in the shed. He couldn't bring himself to sell it. By the summer of 1989, Vince had 18 regular custom customers and the 770E was fully paid off. He was 41 years old. His son Nathan was 10. His daughter Emily was 7. The farm was profitable. The custom work was steady. And then the drought came. It started in June. No rain for 3 weeks, then 4, then 6. The corn came up thin and stayed short. By mid-July, some fields were already lost. By August, the whole region was in severe drought. Vince's own corn crop failed almost completely. He harvested what he could, but it wasn't enough to cover seed and fertilizer costs for the year. The custom work disappeared. Farmers who'd hired him every year for a decade canceled their contracts. There wasn't enough corn worth chopping to justify the expense. Vince brought in $800 that summer. The year before, he'd made $6,200. Marie's job at the co-op kept them afloat, but barely. They burned through their savings by October. In November, Vince took out an operating loan, $4,500 at 11%, to cover property taxes and heating oil and the minimum payments on the credit cards they'd been using for groceries. In December, the bank called again. This time it wasn't Roger Stenmark. It was a woman named Linda Hoffman, and she worked in collections. She said the bank needed to see a plan. She said Vince's operating loan was secured against his equipment, and if he couldn't demonstrate a path to repayment, they'd need to explore asset liquidation. Vince asked what that meant. She said it meant selling equipment. He asked which equipment. She said the 770E would cover the loan and leave him with about $1,200. Vince didn't say anything for a long time. Linda said she was sorry. She said the bank didn't want to do this, but they had obligations to their other depositors. Vince said he understood. He hung up the phone and told Marie. She didn't cry. She just sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long time. Then she said, "What are we going to do after?" Vince said he didn't know. The auction was held on February 11th, 1990, at the First Lutheran Church parking lot in Waseca. It was a cold morning, 6 degrees with wind, and there were maybe 40 people there, most of them dealers or farm equipment brokers looking for deals. The 770E sold for $5,100 to a custom operator from Faribault. Vince didn't know him. The man paid cash, loaded the machine onto a trailer, and drove away by noon. Vince used the money to pay off the operating loan and settled the rest of his debts. He had $380 left. He still owned the land. He still owned his father's old equipment. But the custom work was over. For the next 11 years, Vince farmed his own 240 acres and worked part-time jobs to cover the gaps. He worked for a feed mill in Waseca 3 days a week. He drove a grain truck during harvest for other farmers. He did mechanical work in the winter, fixing equipment, welding broken parts, rebuilding engines. Marie kept her job at the co-op. Nathan and Emily grew up knowing their father worked harder than anyone they knew and still barely kept the farm going. In 1995, Nathan graduated high school and left for college in Minneapolis. He didn't come back. In 1998, Emily graduated and moved to Duluth. She didn't come back either. Vince didn't blame them. The farm had been his choice, not theirs. By the year 2000, Vince was 52 years old. Marie was talking about retirement. The farm was still breaking even, but just barely. Vince had started thinking about what came next, whether to sell, whether to lease the land out, whether there was any point in holding on. And then he saw the ad in the Waseca County News. Estate auction, Harold Voss Farm, Saturday, April 15, 2000. New Holland 770E forage harvester, 1976, plus tractors, tillage equipment, and miscellaneous farm items. Vince read it twice. Harold Voss had been one of his first custom customers back in 1976. He died the previous winter, and his sons were selling off the equipment. Vince called the auction company and asked if they could tell him the serial number on the 770E. They could. It was his machine. He didn't tell Marie right away. He spent 2 days thinking about it, trying to figure out whether it made sense, whether it was practical, whether it was something he needed or just something he wanted. The machine was 24 years old. He didn't have any custom customers anymore. He didn't need a forage harvester. He could hire someone to chop his corn for $15 an acre, and it would be cheaper than owning the equipment. But every time he thought about letting it go to someone else, something tightened in his chest. On Thursday evening, he told Marie. She was folding laundry in the living room. He sat down across from her and said, "Harold Voss's sons are selling his equipment on Saturday. The 770E is in the sale." Marie looked at him. "Your 770E?" "Yeah." She set down the towel she was holding. "Are you thinking about buying it?" "I don't know," he said. "Maybe." "Do we need it?" "No." "Can we afford it?" "I've got some money set aside," he said. "From the side jobs. About 3,000. Marie was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "If you want it, go get it." The auction was on a Saturday morning in mid-April. The weather was clear and cool, and there were maybe 60 people there, more than Vince had expected. The 770E came up for bid around 10:30. The auctioneer started at $2,000. Someone bid $2,200, then $2,400, then $2,600. Vince raised his hand at $2,800. The bidding paused. The auctioneer called for $3,000. No one moved. He called it again. Still nothing. Sold for $2,800 to the man in the back. Vince paid with a cashier's check he'd gotten from the bank the day before. He'd been saving for 2 years. Money from side jobs, money from a good corn crop in 1998, money he and Marie had set aside in case something broke down or someone got sick. He loaded the 770E onto his trailer and drove it home. Marie was standing in the driveway when he pulled in. She didn't say anything. She just looked at the machine, then at him, and then she nodded once. That night, Vince walked out to the shed and stood next to the 770E in the dark. It looked older than he remembered. The paint was faded. The corn head had been replaced with a newer one. There were dents and scratches and rust spots that hadn't been there before. But the feed rolls were the same. The blower housing was the same. The serial number plate was still bolted to the frame, just above the hitch. He'd lost this machine because he couldn't afford to keep it. And now he had it back, not because he needed it, but because he couldn't let it go to someone else. Vince didn't restart the custom work. He used the 770E to chop his own corn for the next 18 years. Every August, he'd pull it out of the shed, grease the fittings, check the belts, and run it through his fields the same way he always had. Nathan came home for visits twice a year. Emily called every Sunday. Neither of them wanted the farm. Vince didn't push them. He understood. The farm had given him something, a way to live, a way to work, a way to belong to something bigger than himself. But it had also taken things. Time with his children. Years he could have spent doing something else. The machine he'd had to sell, and the 11 years he'd spent working without it. In 2015, Marie was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. The progression was slow but steady. By 2017, she needed help with things she used to do on her own. Vince sold 160 acres in the spring of 2018 to pay for her care. He kept 80 acres and leased them out to a neighbor's son. He moved Marie into a memory care facility in Waseca that fall. He visited her every day. Some days she knew him. Some days she didn't. Some days she asked about the farm, and he'd tell her it was fine, that everything was taken care of, that she didn't need to worry. He retired from farming in December of 2018. He was 70 years old. The neighbor who leased his land asked if he wanted to sell the 770E. Vince said no. The neighbor asked why. Vince didn't have a good answer. It's still in the shed. The same shed his father built in 1951. The same shed where Vince parked it the day he brought it home in 1976, and again the day he brought it back in 2000. The paint has faded to a dull green-gray. The tires are cracked. The corn head is long past serviceability, but the machine is still there, and Vince still owns it. Marie passed away in March of 2023. Nathan and Emily came home for the funeral. They stayed for a week. They asked their father what he wanted to do with the farm, with the equipment, with the house. Vince said he hadn't decided yet, but he did say one thing. He said the 770E wasn't for sale. Nathan asked why. Vince thought about it for a long time. He said, "Because I already sold it once." Nathan didn't understand. Emily didn't either, but Vince didn't try to explain. Some things you can't explain to people who weren't there, who didn't live through the years when the payments came due and the crops failed, and the only choice you had was to let go of the thing you'd built your life around. Who didn't spend 11 years working other people's fields, driving other people's trucks, fixing other people's equipment, knowing the whole time that the machine you'd bought and lost was out there somewhere, still running, still doing the work you used to do. Who didn't stand in an auction lot on a cold April morning and watch that same machine roll past on a trailer, knowing you could walk away and let it go forever, or you could bring it home and own it again, even though owning it wouldn't change anything that had already happened. Some decisions don't end when you make them. They keep moving forward, year after year, shaping everything that comes after in ways you don't see until it's too late to change direction. Vince bought the New Holland 770E because he thought it would build something, and it did. For 13 years, it built a business, a reputation, a livelihood, and then it was gone. Not because it failed, not because it broke, but because the world shifted, and the machine that was supposed to protect him became the thing he couldn't afford to keep. For 11 years, he worked without it, he survived, he adapted, he made do with less, and then he got it back. Not because he needed it, not because it made financial sense, but because losing it had taught him what it meant. The years he lost weren't the machine's fault, but they were the cost of learning that some things matter more than whether they make sense on paper. The 770E didn't save Vince's farm. It didn't bring his children back. It didn't stop time or reverse the decisions that led to Marie's illness or the slow, inevitable shrinking of the life they'd built together. But it's still there. And that means something. Not to the bank, not to the neighbors, not even to Nathan or Emily, who will probably sell it when their father is gone. But to Vince, it means he got back the thing he should never have had to lose. And maybe that's not victory. But it's not surrender either. It's just what's left when you've lived long enough to see the same choice twice and made it both times, even though the second time you knew exactly what it cost. The machine sits in the shed where his father used to park the equipment he'd bought with cash, back when the world was different and debt was something you avoided, and a man could farm his whole life without owing anyone anything. Vince knows his father would have said buying it back was foolish, that you can't undo the past by spending money on it, that a machine is just a machine, and holding on to it doesn't change what happened. But his father never had to sell something that mattered and then watch someone else use it for 10 years while he worked 3 jobs just to keep the land. His father never stood at an auction and had the chance to take back something he'd lost. And his father never lived long enough to understand that sometimes the point isn't whether it makes sense. Sometimes the point is just that you get to decide. Vince walks out to the shed maybe once a month now. He doesn't run the machine anymore. He just looks at it, checks the tires, makes sure the mice haven't gotten into the cab. He's 76 years old. His knees hurt, his back hurts, he doesn't sleep well. But the 770E is still there. And as long as it is, something he built still exists. Not the custom business, not the life he had with Marie before everything got hard. Not the years he lost, or the version of himself that believed buying the right equipment could protect him from the things he couldn't control. Just the machine. The same one he bought in 1976. The same one he lost in 1990. The same one he brought back in 2000. Still green, still solid, still his. And when Nathan and Emily finally sell the farm, maybe next year, maybe in 5 years, maybe after Vince is gone, they'll sell the 770E too. Someone will buy it. Maybe a collector, maybe a museum, maybe another farmer who needs parts, and it will leave again. But this time, Vince won't be the one who had to let it go.